It didn't begin with fire or explosions. It began with silence. A silence broken by a single document. On August 1st, 2025, Washington signed a decree that shook an entire nation. A 50% tariff, slapped overnight, on Burkina Faso's most valuable natural export, shea butter. No warnings. No negotiations. No conversations. Just a signature and a storm. For over 20 years, Burkina Faso's shea industry had been the backbone of survival for more than 160,000 women. It fueled cosmetic empires in Europe and the United States. It connected village hands in Africa to beauty shelves in New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. And then, without ceremony, it was branded unworthy. The message from the West was crystal clear: bend or break. But President Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier who became a statesman, chose neither. Within hours, he summoned his trade council, faced his people, and called the tariff what it truly was: economic warfare dressed as policy. They tax our labor. They tax our heritage. They tax the very hands that feed our women, he declared. His words spread like wildfire, racing from ministries in the capital to the smallest villages in the countryside. In the rural town of Bolster, a woman named Aminata sat cross-legged on the red earth, her hands stained with shea, her livelihood suddenly hanging by a thread. Thick with churned shea paste, Aminata's hands moved slowly, unsure if tomorrow would bring food or hunger. Across the nation, the rhythm broke. Cooperatives stalled. Warehouses slammed their doors shut. Trucks loaded with drums of raw butter sat abandoned under the burning African sun. What Washington called strategy, Traoré named for what it was: betrayal. He did not plead. He pivoted. And in that pivot, a new chapter began. By turning east instead of west, Traoré invited a different future to the table. One not bound by colonizers. One not chained to their currencies and games of control. What happened next would redraw more than trade routes. It would challenge the balance of power itself. Redraw not just trade maps, but the very meaning of African independence. Could one embargo, signed by a superpower, ignite a continent's economic rebellion? Or would the crushing weight of retaliation break a fragile nation still scarred by centuries of silence? The old order expected Burkina Faso to fold, but it didn't. It stood, defiant, and the world watched, not with pity, but with questions. The impact of Washington's tariff struck fast, and it struck deep. Procurement offices went dark. Contracts vanished. And in towns across Burkina Faso, silence replaced the hum of commerce. Export managers dialed frantically, chasing American buyers. But in Missouri, in Florida, in Texas, the lines went dead. Some distributors quietly rerouted their orders to Ghana and Benin. Others froze completely, terrified of Washington's next move. In Bobo Dioulasso, the nation's transport lifeline, trucks packed with shea butter sat idle for days. Drivers slept in their cabs. Men paid by the journey, trapped with nowhere to go. Within just 48 hours, haulage collapsed by 32%. Factories stopped procurement. Cooperatives shut their gates. And a billion-dollar industry built on generations of labor stood at the edge of paralysis. Women stood beneath neem trees, waiting for instructions that never came. In Kaya, a cooperative leader, Salamata Konate, gathered her team and spoke with quiet fire. "They think we are just exporters," she said. "But we are mothers. We are fighters." Across the Atlantic, the silence was deafening. No press conference from the White House. No statement from trade officials. Only vague whispers about national interest and economic realignment. But inside Washington's corridors, there was no silence. There was calculation. The aim was simple: pressure, disruption, control. But what Washington didn't calculate was Captain Traoré's readiness to pivot. On August 2nd, in Ouagadougou, he summoned regional agricultural unions and declared an emergency support program for local cooperatives. "They will not break us by starving our people," he said, his voice steady, uncompromising. That phrase traveled faster than any shipment of shea butter ever had. In Nairobi and Mumbai, his defiance led the headlines. In Dubai and Dhaka, market analysts debated the fallout. And in London, whispers began to circulate in the financial district. Had Burkina Faso just changed the rules of the game? The shea futures index spiked 11% as traders scrambled to hedge against supply risk. In Lagos, exporters hesitated to sign contracts, afraid of becoming collateral in a new trade war. But this fight was never just about butter. It was about control, about who owns the first mile of a global supply chain and who collects the last dollar from it. Inside the Ministry of Industry in Ouagadougou, Minister Sorzerbo put it bluntly. This isn't supply disruption, he said. This is a test of national backbone. And that backbone would soon be tested harder than ever before. In Illinois and Georgia, cosmetic labs scrambled to reformulate, swapping Burkina Faso's butter with Ghanaian stock and synthetic substitutes. But nothing compared. The signature blend of creamy texture, the perfect balance of fatty acids, it couldn't be replicated. In Denver, a mid-tier beauty brand quietly admitted the truth. Their new formula felt off. Customer complaints poured in. Creams no longer absorbed. Bombs left a greasy film. Brand loyalty began to crack. And then came the deeper wound, identity loss. Because American consumers weren't just buying moisturizer. They were buying authenticity. And authenticity was slipping away. Clean, ethical sourcing. That's what customers demanded. And they noticed the change immediately. Labels stopped listing origins. Reviews lit up with anger. This isn't real Shea. Something's wrong. Across boutique beauty circles, a phrase began to circulate, losing the soul of the brand. Inside a small natural skincare shop in Chicago, Clarissa Woodson stared at empty shelves. 3 months now, she whispered. No Shea again. She wasn't alone. From Brooklyn to Los Angeles, shop owners felt the same squeeze. And while smaller stores fought to survive, the larger companies were already making their next move. Giants like Estée Lauder absorbed the shock with scale, suspending a few product lines, cutting corners elsewhere. But small businesses? They bled. Staff laid off. Storefronts shuttered. Margins evaporated. In Miami, one skincare founder admitted she was taping shipping boxes by hand just to save a few dollars. If rent spikes again, she said, we're finished. Meanwhile, Traoré wasn't celebrating. Behind the midnight walls of the presidential palace, he studied logistics corridors, prioritized road repairs, and ordered new trade routes eastward. He wasn't playing catch-up. He was 3 moves ahead. And then, on August 4th, at exactly 10:17 a.m., the counterpunch landed. China's Ministry of Commerce announced official import licenses for 128 Burkinabe companies. The deal was clean. 5 years. No quotas. Direct rail access. Priority refining rights. No handouts. No debt. Just trade. Inside the National Palace, Traoré stood before a vast map of West Africa. His finger traced the old American route, then slid east until it stopped. At the port of Gwanga, Traoré placed his finger on the map. This is no longer theory, he said. This is our new axis. The words rippled through every ministry. What began as defense was now direction. Shea butter, once a forgotten commodity, had become the center of a global realignment. In the hills of Kenadougou, women danced outside their cooperatives. It means we work tomorrow, said Ao, adjusting her headscarf. And next week, and maybe next year. That same week, Chinese buyers landed in Abidjan and Lomé to coordinate shipments. The Belt and Road Corridor flickered to life. Shea from a landlocked nation now flowed east, carried not just by trade, but by policy, pride, and precision. Across African media, a new phrase began to circulate, Shea diplomacy. And in those 2 words was a quiet suggestion that Burkina Faso had shifted more than butter. Inside the steel and glass labs of Sinor Biotech in Chengdu, stainless tanks gleamed under LED light, each calibrated to refine shea butter, not from Ghana, not from Benin, from Burkina Faso. The transformation was swift. Weeks earlier, China had only dabbled in the niche. Now it was positioning to dominate it. The moment Traoré signed the $2.1 billion agreement, Beijing answered, not with slogans, but with steel. 3 processing facilities broke ground in Shenzhen, Tianjin, and Nanjing. Hundreds of jobs promised. Supply chains reoriented overnight. For China, the pivot secured quality. For Burkina Faso, it secured sovereignty. No longer would shea be shipped raw, to be stripped of its value elsewhere. No longer refined abroad. The New Deal embedded processing clauses, technology transfers, and reinvestment mandates into every line. Solar dryers, logistics grants, factory training, not optional extras, signed obligations. For decades, African nations had exported their wealth for cents, only to buy it back in glossy packages for hundreds of dollars. Traoré called it for what it was, economic servitude. And in Ouagadougou, his government rewrote the equation. New cooperative programs taught export scheduling, inventory management, even international negotiation. Women who once cracked shea nuts barefoot now scanned shipping manifests and spoke Mandarin. Each refined ton carried a national stamp, the emblem of women's gold. This wasn't just branding. It was identity. In Accra and Lagos, radio hosts debated, could cocoa and palm oil follow the shea model? In Dar es Salaam, fashion shows unveiled makeup lines labeled shea for sovereignty. And in Johannesburg, activist murals read, from soil to sovereignty. Burkina Faso's pride had grown from protest to policy, from crisis to blueprint. It wasn't just economic. It was cultural. Even the Ministry of Education joined in. New curriculum modules on indigenous trade history rolled out across classrooms. One assignment asked, "What does sovereignty smell like?" A 12-year-old girl answered, "It smells like the butter my grandmother makes." Meanwhile, in Washington, trade officials clung to a tired narrative of national security. They insisted the tariffs were defensive, a tool to level the playing field. Washington called it leveling the playing field. But behind closed doors, frustration boiled. The move had backfired. Small businesses collapsed. American brand loyalty eroded. Supply chains frayed. And yet, Burkina Faso did not gloat. It governed. In Paris, officials bid for access they once assumed was theirs by default. In Addis Ababa, diplomats reviewed a framework from Traoré. Not a plea, a proposal. Clear, bold, signed. "We used to ask," whispered one West African envoy. "Now we negotiate." On runways in Seoul and on store shelves in Lagos. Burkina Faso's shea butter carried a different scent and a different purpose. It was no longer filler. It was a flag. Analysts at the African Development Bank called the shift seismic. "They've gone," said one senior economist. "From being exploited to being irreplaceable." Even the Wall Street Journal broke with precedent, running a rare front-page story. From shea to strategy, Africa's new power broker. And still, in Ouagadougou, there were no parades. Inside the National Cooperative, Traoré chaired midnight sessions on corridor repairs. He reviewed refinery timelines. He checked every clause, every document, to ensure they matched the dignity he had promised. He hadn't just rewritten a deal. He had redrawn the map. Now the question wasn't whether the pivot worked, but how far it would reach. Would cocoa be next? Would other African nations dare to reimagine their exports, not as donations to the global machine, but as sovereign tools of leverage? Could a new doctrine of trade, rooted in fairness, dignity, and vertical power, become Africa's blueprint for the century? To stand against the might of old empires and volatile markets? Few thought it possible. But inside boardrooms from Nairobi to New York, executives whispered the same word they once used dismissively. Burkina Faso. This time, they said it with caution, with respect, with strategy. The world had expected silence. Traoré delivered alignment. That shift, subtle but total, had turned a landlocked country into the key holder of a new supply order. By mid-August 2025, Burkina Faso's economic pulse beat with new clarity. At the Yerba refinery, manager Idrissa Bakuno walked past crates marked for Guangdong, each barrel stamped with women's gold. 2 weeks earlier, he had prepared to shut down. Now he was onboarding 10 new workers, most of them single mothers. The turn from uncertainty to resurgence was not gradual. It was surgical. It was strategic. President Traoré had done more than react. He had anticipated betrayal, mapped alternatives, executed a pivot rooted not in ideology, but in